Today I'm going to be showing you guys 3 different types of trap beats. We have chordal trap, ambient trap, and discordant trap. I'm going to be showing you guys what makes each of these styles of beats different from one another, as well as how you can make these types of beats yourself. Once again guys, as usual, the drum kit is available to download in the description box below for free. Leave a comment, let me know which style of trap beat that you're about to hear is your favorite, and while you're at it, give that like button a little tickle. Alright, so let's start off with the chordal type of trap beat. What this is a type of trap beat that's a little bit more melodic comparatively, and what we're going to be doing is using a chord progression, building different types of chords in order to create these melodies. Alright, so first what we're going to do is choose a type of sound that would be good for this style of trap beat. What we want is a sound that can be played in polyphony. What this means is that we can play more than one key at a time. For example, here's what I mean. If I play this note here and I play this note a little bit later, it'll play both at the same time. As opposed to a sound that is monophonic, which means if we try to play more than one note at a time, all it's going to do is play the last note that we played. We also want with this style of trap beat is a sound that has a lot of resonance to it or a lot of hold to it. So what I mean is if I hit a key, it's going to continue playing the sound even if I let go or as I hold it. So here's an example of the type of sound that is a good example here. So as long as the keys are held down, the sound is going to continue to play. As opposed to this style of sound, even if I hold the keys down, it's just going to strike once and then just stop playing. Lastly, when you're choosing your sound, you want to make sure you choose the type of sound that takes up the mid-range of the frequency spectrum. So if we're making a trap beat and we know that our 808s are going to take up the low end of the frequency spectrum, our hi-hats and our percussion noises or whatever else are going to take up the high end, we want to make sure that we take a sound that's going to fill up the middle frequencies of the frequency spectrum. So now that we have our sound picked out, what I'm going to do is just start building my chord progression by figuring out which initial chord sounds good to me. So I like the way this chord here sounds. I'm by no means a music theory expert, so what I like to do is use this plugin called Scalar here. So all you really have to do is just play an initial chord that sounds cool to you, and what it will do is just start suggesting other chords that you can use to build a chord progression. So using Scalar, I was eventually able to make this very basic chord progression here. All it did was just suggest me a few different types of chords, and I just built this myself. Now that I have my basic chord progression here, what I'm going to start doing is just making it a little bit more interesting by adding a little bit more movement into the chord progression by moving notes around here and there. Just overall try to make things a little bit more interesting by adding a little bit more movement. What I also did was I created a secondary pattern, again using that exact same basic chord progression and just adding more movement in other places, just to create a secondary pattern to keep things a little bit more interesting. Alright, so we have the main part of the beat built, the main chord progression. Let's start filling in the other textures that are going to fill up the other frequency ranges that this chord progression right now does not fill up. Alright, so to start off here, I just created this simple drum loop in order to get a good sense of what the rhythm of the beat should be. Next up, let's add the bass line. So since we have our chord progression built here, and this is heavily dictating the overall melody of the beat, we're going to be a little bit more limited in terms of what we can get away with our bass line. What we have to do is make sure our bass is going to be in the same overall direction as our chord progression. Otherwise, if we have the bass line going in one direction and this chord progression here with the main melody that we've built is going in another, that's just an easy way for your beat to end up sounding like a mess. You just have to adhere to whatever the main chord progression is doing in the beat. So what you could do is just take your main chord progression here and just use the root note from this progression as your main bass line. It's just going to be a very simple bass line if you do this. But it pretty much fits perfectly. So once again, just like our main chord progression, I'm just going to add a little bit more variance into this bass line just to make it a little bit more interesting, add a little bit more movement into the beat. So eventually this is what I came up with. As you can hear, it just still follows the main direction that our main chord progression is providing, but it's just adding a little bit more movement just to keep things a little bit more interesting. Alright, so now that our mid-range of the beat is filled up with our main sound here, the main chord progression, and after adding in the low end of the frequency spectrum with our bass, all that's left really is the high end here. But you guys can notice that the main chord progression, it has a lot of density and a lot of movement in it, as well as our low end, just a lot of things going on with the bass line. So when it comes to our high end, I'm going to keep things pretty simple just because I know if I get too ambitious with the counter melody with the notes I'm going to be playing in the high end of the frequency spectrum, it's an easy way for the beat to sound overproduced. So as you guys can see, I picked the right spots in the beat where these textures won't congest the beat, making sure to leave plenty of room in the beat. This is why most of the textures reside in the beginning and the end of the bars. And there you have it. That's how you make a chordal type of trap beat. What you want to do is focus in on the main chord progression, make sure that fills up as much of the mid frequencies as possible, have it be the main component of the beat. Make it interesting, add a little bit of movement, and from there what you're going to do is add the low end and the high end frequency sounds just to balance out the beat overall. So next up is an ambient type of trap beat. What we want to do with this type of trap beat is play around with the foreground and the background of the beat. We want to make sure the foreground of the beat is as minimal as possible and have the background of the beat be as dense as possible. I'll show you what I mean here exactly. So the first thing I did was I chose my main loop here. I just chose this loop from Arcade. So the good thing about this loop is that it's melodically interesting, it's got a lot of movement in it, which is exactly what we need. We don't want the same note playing over and over again. As well, it takes up the exact type of frequency range that we want for a trap beat. It has that mid-range density, which is exactly what we're looking for. Now what I want to do is just stack a bunch of effects on top of this sound in order to move it to the background of the beat. We can do that using reverbs, delays, all sorts of things. So as you guys can see, I just stacked a whole bunch of effects on top of this loop, and this is how it sounds now. So if I turn all these effects off, it just sounds like it's a lot more in the foreground right in our face, but if I turn all the effects on, everything just sort of feels like it gets pushed to the background. And again, like I mentioned with this type of beat, what we want to do is just play around with the foreground and the background. We want to keep the foreground as minimal as possible and stack most of our sounds into the background. So I'm going to start adding more layers to this beat, and again, just keeping them in the background. So here's what I eventually came up with. As you can see, I added some instruments, a few effects noises, some ambiance noises, and I pushed them all into the background in order to create this cool wall of ambiance. So now what I'm going to start doing is adding the drums and being careful with how much I add, just because I want to make sure I have the right balance in terms of the foreground and the background. What we want to keep in mind is that the more sounds I add into the foreground, the less ambient the beat will sound. So what I want to do is keep the drumming relatively sparse. As you guys can see, I didn't get too crazy with the snare or the kick. With the snare here, just a relatively simple pattern, no crazy snare rolls or anything. As well with the kick, just kept it relatively sparse. There's not too much going on, and this helps to keep the beat feeling ambient overall. As you can see with the 808 pattern I came up with, I have the 808 playing at the beginning and the end of this 2-bar stretch here. And I kept the middle of the beat very open. So the reason why I don't have an 808 bass playing in the middle is because I want to focus on ambience. There's going to be parts in the beat where I have to add bass, but if I want to make an ambient beat, I have to make sure there are gaps in the beat where there's not much going on. So I chose the middle section here just to have pretty much no instruments playing, where you can see I don't even have a kick on the first measure here, just to keep the beat open in this section and just keep the beat feeling ambient overall. So with ambient beats, it's not only making sure the foreground and the background have this ambient feel, but making sure the spaces in the beat where you start adding sounds in is going to be very limited as well. And there you go. With ambient types of beats, it becomes a balancing act between the foreground and the background. We want to shove as much stuff in the back as possible, make sure it's still melodic, interesting, and we want to make sure the front of the beat, the foreground, is pretty simple, relatively speaking. There are certain instruments that we're going to have to make sure are in the foreground, like the drums and the bass, but we can also make sure that those are sparse. We don't have to play them all the time. As you guys can see, the kick here has a huge gap in it. The 808 pattern also has a huge gap in it. So it becomes this balancing act of making sure you keep the foreground pretty simple, pretty sparse, and the background as dense as possible. Finally, we have the discordant style of trap beat. This is a type of beat that's going to be amelodic. It's not going to be focused in on the melody and having a musicality. What we're going to focus on instead is the textures of the beat, making sure those are as interesting as possible and it fills up as much space in the beat as possible. And we're not going to have as much focus in on creating a melodic type of beat. So starting off, I have this hi-hat loop here. As you can hear, it's not like a typical hi-hat loop. It has shakers in it. It has this cool percussion sound. It has a little bit of reverb in it. It just sounds a little bit more interesting than our typical usual trap hi-hat. So now that we have the hi-hat loop, I'm also going to add a whole bunch of effects on top. As you can see, I added some saturation, some reverb, some flanging, some chorus, just to help the hi-hat loop here, again, be more interesting and take up more room in the beat. If we don't have much going on with the melodics of the beat, and we're going to focus in on just the textures, this is something that we're going to have to do with every single sound that we use. So this is how it sounds. Without all these effects, it just doesn't sound as present in the beat. But if we turn this on, all of a sudden it just becomes a lot more interesting and a lot more textured. I added a few more sounds into the beat, as you guys can hear. Some percussion and effects noises, some distortion as well. As you guys can hear, I'm not necessarily interested with how musical or melodic this beat sounds. I'm more interested in creating a sort of wall of noise in order to fill the beat. Next up is the 808s. Compared to the other 808s in this video, this one is going to be a lot more dense and just take up a lot more room in the beat. As you guys can hear, this 808 just takes up a lot more room in the beat because I focused in on making it as textured as possible. The way I did this was through the use of distortion. So this is how the 808 would sound without all the distortion effects on top. As you can hear, it just doesn't take up as much room in the beat this way. But as soon as I add distortion and a little bit of saturation as well, just becomes a lot more present in the beat. So for those that don't know exactly what distortion does, I'm going to open up an EQ here on top of this 808. I'm going to turn off all the distortion once again, and I'll show you exactly how the frequency pattern looks now. So there's not much going on up here, as you can see, but as soon as I turn these all on once again, now there's a little bit more harmonic presence in the higher end of the spectrum. This is exactly what's so useful about distortion. It'll basically just start adding tones into your sounds that didn't exist before and just help you fill up more room in the beat. You can also hear with the 808 pattern, I have it pretty much hitting all throughout the beat. The reason why is because I'm not going to have too much other noises that give me the opportunity to fill out the beat, so I'm going to do so with this 808. So since this is a discordant type of trap beat, I didn't want to get too musical with the 808. I didn't have a lot of slides or a lot of note changes. I just kept it pretty simple, relatively speaking. I just have these little switch ups at the end of the beat here, and that's pretty much it. Now I'm going to add in the drum loop. Since we have a lot of room to play around with in this type of beat, I can get a little bit more audacious, a little bit more crazy with the drum loop and the drum pattern that I create. Here's the drum pattern that I eventually came up with. Again, I didn't get too crazy with the snares, but with the kick, just kicks all over the place. I got pretty ambitious with the kicks just because there's just a lot of room I can fill out in the beat, and so I did so just using these kicks. You can do the exact same thing with using snare rolls if you want, or hi-hat rolls, whatever. The difficult part about making this type of beat is keeping things interesting just because there isn't much happening melodically. So what I like to do is create a sort of 1-2 switch up where I'll have a basic pattern playing and then I'll have a switch up into another sound where I'll duck out one sound and replace it with another. As you guys can hear, I removed the hi-hat pattern and I just replaced it with this sort of amelodic percussion noise. With discordant trap, there is a focus in on making sure that each texture is as interesting as possible, just because we are foregoing the melodics of the beat. We don't have much musicality, so we have to make up for it by making the beat interesting in different ways. There's going to be a focus in on using your effects in order to help bring out each and every sound that you have in the beat in order to make it sound full and interesting. And there you have it, 3 different types of trap beats and how to make each one. Let me know in the comment section down below which one of these styles is your favorite. Also, please do like and subscribe. The drums are available to download in the description box below as well. And I'll see you guys next Tuesday.